So here we are with the scene. There's a few parts of it that could use a little bit of work, but if you remember, my target was to take this base image and apply this kind of colorizing to it, which I think the decals are going to be the best way to make that happen. You, of course, can do it with lighting and other things, which I will also be doing shortly as well. And a couple other things that I saw in the base images that I haven't added yet. One of them being cables. This has a lot of cables in it, and I'm going to quickly show you a way to do that. If you go back to the Place Actors window, you'll find that if you type in cable, you can find a cable actor. And this is going to add a physics-based cable to your scene, which I will actually add a wire material to this that comes from this engineer pack. And then you'll find in the details panel for this, you'll have a lot of controls for said wire. So I'm going to actually scale it down a bit because that's going to be the width on the wire. And then I'm going to take a second to position it in the scene. So I'm going to come over here, I'll rotate it 90, and we'll have it hanging mysteriously from right back here. Now there's a few things that aren't really working for it, so first let's see how that feels. Okay, well, that seems okay. And if I just rotate this a little bit, that seems like a fine cable. Now, one thing that we'll definitely want to change is the number of segments, which is directly going to be, one, how detailed the physics is, but also how smooth the curvature is going to be. So I'm going to rotate this, and I'm going to extend out the end location for another wire here. I can see that this one is actually intersecting with this plant, which I'm not really crazy about. So I'm going to take a second to move it so that that is not the case anymore. And now that looks much better. And so I can take a second to populate these wires however I want. I'm not actually going to put a ton of them in because I'm already pretty happy with how the scene is turning out, but I will take a second to put some wires in really quickly. I've also taken a second to change the material color for some violets. So all I did was I opened up the violets from the Megascans pack, and I just added a bright red color overlay on them, which, if we take a look at what the foliage looks like, you'll see here they are all red and pink. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop back into the foliage brush. I'm going to shift, select all those, and turn them off. And then I'm just going to grab a few of these lilies. I don't really want the pink flowers, so I'm just going to grab those, and I will turn these on now. And I'll need to take a second to adjust their settings, make sure that their ground slope angle is set to 180 for a max. And I'm going to increase their scale to like 0.5 to 0.7. And now we could paint some bright red accents into the scene, which I will leave my camera to do. Now that I've put the final foliage in, we're going to do a couple more things before we start rendering this out. I can still see I'm not really crazy about the polygon count on this wire, so I am actually going to increase it one more time. I'm then going to start grabbing a few more decals from the Quixel bridge. Now, since I really just want color fills on the environment, I'm just going to grab something that has a shape. So this lightning bolt, for example. I could also take an image and apply it as a decal, but in this case, I'm just going to start by using this graphic fill. I'm going to add it to my scene. just go ahead and I'm going to duplicate this, and in this duplicate I'm going to add a color overlay to it. Which will allow me to make it a bit orange. And actually I'm going to duplicate the base texture, because this one will be much easier to just change via the hue and saturation. And now in this duplicate I will apply that image texture, and now I can use this duplicate and use this in the scene. Now, how invasive I want this to be is up to me at this point. I'm just going to go a little wild with it and see what happens. I'm not too concerned with the specifics at the moment. I'm just trying to get some interesting coloring to happen. Now, I highly recommend that as you go through this process, you get in the habit of taking screenshots of your piece. So to do that, you'll want to press the G key, which will help you hide all of the scene icons. And then in the top left, you can take high-resolution screenshots. Now, obviously this is bouncing, so that will be captured in the screenshot. And you can also set the screen size multiplier, which is going to be based off the resolution of the screen you're working on. So in this case, if I have a screenshot multiplier 1 and I capture, this will capture out a screenshot at that resolution. You'll see here I had captured out the previous version, and now we have this. And this will be a really great way to rapidly iterate on the color and see the results of that. Now, here, I'm really not super jazzed with how this cable is behaving, so I'm just going to move it up into the scene more. It's bouncing quite a lot because that number of segments is high. But with this in place now, I'm going to experiment a little bit with the lighting. So I have these lights set, and I really quite like this version of the scene in general. So before I start making any more changes, what I actually recommend doing at this point is to make a duplicate of your level. So this level for me is called the EX scene. I am going to right click and duplicate that and save it. So now I have a version of it that's going to be like this no matter what. But on this version of the scene I can keep making changes, so I can always return to the other version if I need. I'm going to select my scene camera, and one of the first things that I'm actually going to do is I'm going to adjust the focal length. I may not decide to have it variable, but I'm going to try it. So with the camera selected, I'm going to go into the focus settings and set it to manual. And then I'm going to say draw a debug plane, which will put a purple plane into the scene, which I drag in place for where I want the scene to be in focus, and then I can uncheck that box. So what this is doing, as you can see on the screen, is it is going to blur everything away from this range. And the controller for this is actually the aperture on the camera. So if I decrease the aperture, that area close to that will become more in focus while everything else becomes blurrier. But then we increase the aperture, more and more of the scene comes into focus. Now, in general with photography, there's two versions. One, you want everything to be in focus, and the other, you want only the subject of the scene to be in focus. For this one, I'm actually pretty happy with how it was looking when everything was in focus, but I highly recommend that in general, you give a very focused subject to your scene. So for this one, I will actually disable that focal blur. And now we're ready to start manipulating the lights. So with the lights that we have three main lights. And if I just change their colors, we can rapidly make some big changes to the scene. So I can make this one blue, this one, which is the foreground, the shadows, I could make red, and then that background, we can make a contrasting blue-green even. And just having those three lights, with one being the foreground, the midground, and the background, now we have made a really nice, drastically different color palette for our scene. with some of these decals, I'm going to experiment a little by turning them on and off, just to see how they feel. I think the one I'm maybe least happy with at the moment is this yellow one. But I think I actually like it turning out like this, which is removing those 2 original graffiti pieces that I had in the scene. I can see one thing that's bothering me as well, though, is this decal is tapping this plant, so I'm going to pull it up just a hair. And I think I'm pretty happy with this version of the scene, other than this cable, which is driving me nuts, so I'm actually just going to remove it. And now it feels like there's something missing from here, so instead I think what I'll do is I'm going to grab another one of these vines. I'm just going to pull it forward and position that maybe where that cable had been before. Scale it down a bit, like so. This scene isn't perfect, but I think for now I'm going to call it on this one, and I'm just going to show you how to capture it. So, of course, you can do the high-resolution screenshot, which will be fine for the most part. But what you'll find, and if you zoom in on any of your previous ones, you'll notice that there are some very glaring imperfections, particularly with foliage. And what this is called is a lack of anti-aliasing. So what we'll actually want to do is we will make some quick adjustments via the movie render queue. So you go to Edit and Plugins, you will need to activate the movie render queue, which is a plugin listed here. It's a built-in one, but we'll have to check this box and it will prompt you to restart the engine. I highly recommend you use this movie render queue. This will be how you squeeze the highest quality out of your renders and your scenes. Once you have that set up, we're actually going to set up a movie sequence, and that is going to be how we export out our images. I'm going to go to Cinematics and Level Sequence. I'm just going to call it the Scene Example Capture. And I'm going to double click to open that sequence, which is made for video, and so it's populating it with 150 frames immediately. I'm going to switch here to Cinematic Viewport, which we don't need really for now, but you'll see that this would make for some really excellent video work already, but we'll get into that later. With our camera selected, we can actually just drag and drop it into the sequencer track, and this is the playback stop range. I'm actually just going to set this to 2 frames. We're going to render out 2 frames of this, and that's going to become our screenshot. Basically, this will allow us to use the power of the movie render queue and ensure that, because we'll have 2 frames, that one of them will be what we want. Now that we have this set up, I'm actually just going to click this render this movie to a video, and this will prompt us with the movie render queue settings. When I click on the unsaved config, this will bring up our list view where we can start to control how our scene is going to be rendered. In general, I recommend adding a few specific channels. The PNG sequence will be essential because we don't want JPEGs, we want PNGs. We're going to turn on anti-aliasing, which I recommend. Here is where you're going to need to experiment a little, and this will extend your render time. Since this is just a still image, I'm going to put this number up pretty high and say override. And that will allow us to get a pretty nice render setup. And I'm also going to have it render warm-up frames. I'm going to add the game overrides, and I'm going to add the console variables. Now, I don't really need the console variables particularly for this scene because of how I have it set up, but if you're using depth of field, you absolutely need this because you'll be typing in some specific values which are linked via the Epic documentation. But one of them, for example, that you might want would be your tone mapper shader, or your tone mapper quality, which you could play with, but the main one will be your depth of field quality, which if you mouse over it, you'll see you want this, you would set it to here, and you'd put it as 4. You can play around with a number of different ones, but for my settings, I'm actually not even going to need the console variables for this particular one. The final thing will be to set your output resolution. So I'm just going to do a 1920 by 1920, and I'm going to pick a folder, and we'll save it there. Once we're ready, we hit accept, and we can say render local. And now it's going to compile, it's going to preload, and then it's going to render the frames, the 2 frames, which are going to be our screenshots. And now we can navigate and take a look at our renders. Yeah, so you can see a few imperfections in the scene as you look closely, especially at some of the foliage overlapping and things. But in general, this scene was pretty alright. I'm decently happy with this one. And the main thing to take away from this is how the scene is set up, with an attention to like establishing a foundation, doing foreground, midground, and background lighting, and then taking the time to detail it out and adjust the settings to be what you want.